Hello, everybody. We're back again. This is Peter Duveen, uh, and we are having our nightly civil defense show at the moment. So, thank you for listening in. Tonight, we're going to be reading once again from this fabulous book. It's called The Effects of the Atomic Bomb. Is that what it's called? Effect of the atomic bomb. The effects of something like that. It was written in a revised form in 1950, and it is a terrific book. Even though it was written only 5 years after the first atomic bombs were launched against Japan, it has a wealth of information, probably much of which today might be overlooked. So it is just a terrific source for us. I had skipped ahead to over some of the entries here so that we could learn more about what the effects are of the atomic bomb on the human physiology. And here we are going to be talking about two types of radiation: external residual radiation and internal residual radiation. Internal means if you've eaten something that's radioactive or inhaled it, it kind of sits in the body and radiates. External radiation might be, you have some fallout on the windowsill, or, you might pass by a building that had been highly irradiated by the atomic explosion, and that might end up causing a radiation hazard of some kind. This book seemed to play down the harmful effects of residual radiation, but today I think people are much more sensitive to the effects of radiation and will want to know more about this. So let me get right into it. Says here, if the radiation from an external source is to have any effect on the body, it must pass through the skin in order to reach the underlying tissue. Because of their short range in air and even shorter range, about 0.05 millimeters in tissue, alpha particles are basically helium nuclei consisting of 2 protons and 2 neutrons, if I am not mistaken. Alpha particles are unable to penetrate the outer layer of the skin. What do you know about that? Consequently, these particles are of no importance as an external radiation hazard. The total range of a beta particle may be some meters in air, but it is only a few millimeters in tissue. As a result, beta particles from external sources do not penetrate to the bone marrow or to other vital parts of the body. Nevertheless, these particles have a deleterious effect on the skin, and if present in sufficient amounts, they may represent a significant radiation hazard. The beta particles are basically fast electrons. The reactions following contact with beta emitters represent a form of radiation injury. They may vary from temporary redness to complete destruction of the skin, depending on the dose absorbed. Even mild doses may result in delayed degenerative changes of the skin. So these beta particles sound like they're pretty serious threats. When the hands have been exposed to large amounts of beta radiation, they become swollen within a few days, and this is followed by reddening of the skin. Hemorrhages develop in the superficial tissue of the exposed region, the appearance being similar to a bruise. Subsequently, large blisters form, become confluent, and finally turn into a slough, several weeks being required for the damage to reach a maximum. Unless the exposure of the body to beta particles has been extensive, no generalized illness, in other words, radiation sickness, is associated with the skin injuries. So you're going to have a lot of trouble, like burns on the skin that get very messy and take quite a while to heal, develop and heal, but it will not be anything like penetrating to the bones or the internal organs. Still, it sounds pretty serious. Gamma rays are, as seen earlier, much more penetrating than beta particles, for they are in fact identical with X-rays of short wavelengths. These rays thus constitute the most important type of external radiation. The extent to which gamma rays can penetrate the body depends on the energy of the photon. It will be recalled in this connection that the mean energy of the gamma ray photons from the initial nuclear radiations is about 3 mega-electron volts, compared to about 0.7 mega-electron volts for the residual nuclear radiations. The former are thus highly penetrating. It is of interest to note that in Japan, where the radiation injuries and radiation sickness were due entirely to the initial radiations, the serious damage was mainly of a deep-seated character. For reasons already given, it is unlikely that many individuals will remain in a contaminated area long enough following an atomic explosion to accumulate a dangerous dose of external radiation due to residual gamma rays. Too little is known of the cumulative effects of moderate but continued, in other words, chronic doses of radiation, such as would be absorbed in a contaminated area, to permit an approximate estimate to be made of safe levels. All that can be said is that persons who have received up to 0.1 Roentgens daily for years have shown no ill effects. Larger doses may have to be taken in cases of emergency, but it would be inadvisable to do so at frequent intervals. In general, the clinical symptoms and pathological changes due to chronic doses of radiation over the whole or a large part of the body may be expected to be similar to those for acute doses, the degree of severity depending on the dosage rates and the total accumulated dose. Okay, now internal radiation. Let's see what this is about. The chances of radioactive material entering the system following an atomic explosion are believed to be extremely small. Thus, no form of illness or injury due to internal radiation has been reported following the high air bursts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even when there is considerable contamination of the ground due to fission products, plutonium or uranium, it would be a matter of great difficulty for an appreciable quantity to enter the bloodstream. Although the amounts of fission products, for example, that must be fixed within the body to produce injurious effects are minute, in comparison with the quantities necessary to cause damage by external beta or gamma radiation, it is believed that following an atomic explosion, the internal hazard will be significant only while the external hazard exists. In other words, if in a given area the dosage due to external radiation is down to a safe level, there will in general be little, if any, danger of enough radioactive material being fixed in the system for it to constitute an internal hazard. In view of these circumstances, brief reference only need be made to the subject of internal radiation associated with an atomic explosion. Of course, these days people are much more concerned about radiation, and I'm sure most people would believe that anything radioactive that you ended up eating or breathing in would be a terrible hazard to the human body. But I think what they're saying is that people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who, were in the middle of a terrible conflagration and really were really exposed, or let's just say that there was a hazard of their being exposed to a lot of radiation, did not seem to suffer very many ill effects through this internal radiation. The chemical characteristics of the radioactive material which enters the body are important, for these will determine where a particular species will be deposited. Radioactive isotopes will follow the same metabolic processes as the naturally occurring inactive isotopes of the same elements. But an element not otherwise found in the body will tend to follow the metabolic pattern of one with similar chemical properties that is normally present. Thus, barium, strontium, and radium, which are analogous chemically to calcium, will be deposited in the bone. That's barium, strontium, and radium. I remember strontium-90 was the big one that was supposed to accumulate in milk and make milk a sort of radiation hazard. Let's see what they mention here. The hazard represented by a particular ingested radioactive substance will depend on its solubility, chemical properties, physical state, etc. For these will determine how much will be absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. It should be noted that in order to constitute an internal radiation hazard, the active material must gain access to the circulating blood from which they can be deposited in the bones, liver, spleen, etc. Thus, for all practical purposes, while the radioactive substances are in the stomach and intestines, they are essentially a source of external rather than internal radiation. The extent of absorption is dependent on the chemical form of an element, and it is fortunate that most of the fission products, which are mainly present as oxides after an atomic explosion, are almost insoluble in the body fluids. The same would be true for oxides of the uranium or plutonium, which had escaped fission in the bomb. The oxides of cesium and barium are, of course, soluble in water, and such iodine as might be present would also be largely in soluble form. Energy of radioactive material into the system through wounds or abrasions can be a serious internal radiation hazard. Soluble substances introduced into the bloodstream in this manner are deposited in the body in a very short time. For this reason, care of wounds where radioactive contamination is possible becomes particularly important. The treatment should be the same as for any other wound contaminated with potentially harmful material, such as bacteria, toxic substances, etc. Good surgical care locally is all that is necessary. The danger associated with the inhalation of radioactive dust, such as might be present after an atomic explosion, especially an underground burst, depends both on the chemical nature and the size of the particles. The nose will filter out almost all particles over 10 microns, in other words, 10 to the minus 3 centimeters in diameter, and about 95% of all particles exceeding 5 microns. The optimum particle size for passage from the alveolar space of the lungs to the bloodstream is under 5 microns, and insoluble particles from 1 to 5 microns in diameter may reach the lymphatic system. These facts are important in connection with the design of air filters and respirators for reducing the extent of inhalation of radioactive dusts. So we see that looks like internal radiation is something that does have to be paid attention to, and something that we should give some thought in terms of prevention. And I think more will be said in a different section on decontamination when it comes to decontaminating food, clothing, etc. So what we're going to do is continue this tomorrow, and coming up is a part that I'm rather excited about: genetic effects of radiation, such as genetic mutations, etc. That's going to be an important topic. So after we finish with this internal radiation, we'll go on to that, genetic mutations. So thank you again for coming tonight. I really do appreciate it. I hope this means something to you. After all, we are threatened with nuclear annihilation if the wrong components of a relationship occur between two countries that are nuclear armed. It is something that we ought to pay attention to, especially in our public policy. If we forget these nuclear armaments exist, then someone is going to fill in the gap and make policy, which is what they have been doing. For instance, in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, I think the Americans have felt that they could kick Russia in the shins as many times as they want to, and Russia will really not do anything. That may end up being a very seriously mistaken sort of policy. I guess it occurs when the bully thinks that he's all powerful and that he can deal with any kind of reaction that occurs. Well, some bullies get stomped on too because they pick on the wrong person. So that's something that our foreign policy should take into consideration. And we as citizens, I don't know how much effect we have on that foreign policy, but if we become more aware of the dangers of a nuclear exchange between two countries, we may hope to influence policymakers, whoever they are. And I don't know if it's really our elected representatives. Somewhere up there, they're making policies. Doesn't seem that Americans have any influence on it. But hope springs eternal. Maybe we can nip this in the bud and stop a nuclear exchange from happening by changing our foreign policy. That might be a good approach. Okay, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and hope to see you tomorrow. Have a great evening.